Hello there. Welcome to Translation Theories. We start with the religious story. In Genesis 9:1, God told mankind, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." God wanted people to spread out and fill the whole earth. By building the tower, people were ignoring God's clear instructions. In fact, the word Babel, or as it is pronounced in Arabic, Babel, is derived from the root meaning to confuse. God observed what a powerful force the people unity of purpose created. As a result, he confused their language, causing them to speak many different languages, so they would not understand each other. By doing this, God thwarted their plans. He also forced the people of the city to scatter all across the face of the earth. After this religious story, or away from this religious story, argument for translation was whether it should be word for word or sense for sense. First, Cicero, in the first century, as a translator as well as an orator, matches every word, rhetorical figure, and phrase to the style, conception, and situation of the work in order to express meaning most effectively. Then we have Saint Jerome in the 4th century. He coined the field phenomena of dynamic equivalence. He believed that translation should be equal, not only in meaning, but in quality of style. This means that Saint Jerome was one of the first notable translators to translate sense for sense rather than word for word. Then we move on to the stage of the phase of Dryden. Dryden introduced three different types of translation: metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation. Metaphrase is one of the three ways of transferring, along with paraphrase, imitation. According to him, or to John Dryden, he considers paraphrase preferable to metaphrase, which is literal translation and imitation. Dryden criticizes translators as Ben Jonson, who adopts metaphrase as being verbal copier. We can quote, he said, "It's much like dancing on ropes with fitted legs, a foolish task." So a metaphrase or literal translation is viewed as dancing on ropes. Then the next figure in translation theory is Schleiermacher. He argued that either the translator leaves the writer alone as much as possible and moves the reader toward the writer, or he leaves the reader alone as possible and moves the writer toward the reader. Schleiermacher called this the first method alienation, and the latter, or the second one, naturalization. Later, we see the scholar Lawrence Venuti reintroduce the same distinction as foreignization and domestication. Then we have the next scholar, Roman Jakobson. Thus, it is a linguistic verbal sign that gives an object its meaning, according to Roman Jakobson. Interpretation of a verbal sign, according to Roman Jakobson, can happen in three ways: intralingual, interlingual, and intersemiotic. So we have three types of translation: intralingual, in the same language; interlingual, between two different languages; intersemiotic, between two different semiotic or systems, language systems. Venny and Darbelnet, 1958, compared the stylistics of French and English. This was a new stage in translation studies. Then we have the linguistic theory in translation studies introduced by Catford. According to Catford, 1965, translation is a placement of textual material in one language, source language, by equivalent textual material in another language. Applying more linguistic-based approach to translation. Catford approach to translation equivalence, 1965, took another direction from that of Nida and Taber. Influenced by the linguistic work of Firth and Halliday, he refined Halliday's grammatical rank scale approach to develop the hypothesis that equivalence in translation depends upon the availability of formal correspondence between linguistic terms at different structural levels and ranks, particularly at the sentence level. Catford's main contribution in the field of translation theory is the introduction of concepts of types and shifts of translation. So he introduced the concept of translation shift. Then we move on to Nida and Newmark. Nida introduced formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. These two terms coined by Eugene Nida. These two terms are two dissimilar, different translation approaches, achieving differing level of literalness between the source text and the target text, as employed in biblical translation. Later, Newmark also reintroduced the same distinction between formal and dynamic equivalence in terms of semantic and communicative translation. According to Newmark, communicative translation should be favored in order to avoid reproducing an abnormal, odd-sounding, or semantically inaccurate result. In order to illustrate his point, he uses the example of the communicative translation, beware the dog, instead of the semantically, instead of the semantic translation, dog that bites and bad dog, so that the message is communicated effectively. Then we move on to scholar Julian House. It is assumed that discourse analysis and translation studies have much in common. Some of the areas of research which have been affected by discourse analysis are Halliday's systematic functional grammar, Julian House model of translation quality assessment, and Catherine Rice's text typology in translation. House, 1981 and 1997, and in Baker, 1992, focus on register analysis. It is concerned with variables of field tenor and mode. They adopt Halliday's model of register analysis. Another implication of discourse analysis in relation with systematic functional grammar is Julian House model of translation quality assessment. Having inspired from Halliday's systematic functional grammar, Julian House model of translation quality assessment has been designed as one of the most valuable tools for evaluating translations. As we see here, as we talk, we have register analysis, which focuses on field tenor mode, so context itself. Then we move on to Scopus theory, Vermeer and Rice. The first rule to obey in the process of translation is the purpose of an overall translational action, which can also be interpreted as end justifies means. As defined by Vermeer and translated by Nord, Scopus rule states each text is produced for a given purpose and should serve this purpose. After the polysystem, after the Scopus theory, we have polysystem theory, which focuses on translated literary text. Itmar Ibn Zuhar, introduced by Itmar Ibn Zuhar. Polysystem theory is defined as a theory to account for the behavior and evolution of literary system. In other words, literature is part of social, cultural, literary, and historical framework. A literary system can influence other ones. Then Levy introduced the concept of translation as rewriting. Levy developed the idea of translation as a form of rewriting, which means that any text produced on the basis of another has the intention of adapting that other text to a certain ideology or to a certain poetics, and usually to both. Then in mid-90s, we have the cultural turn in translation, in which we can see a different unit of translation. Instead of the sentence and paragraph and the text, we have the culture as a translation unit. The unit of translation is no longer a word or sentence or paragraph or etc. By Susan Bassnett. This was introduced by Susan Bassnett and Andre Levy. The unit of translation was no longer a word or a sentence or etc. This was introduced by Susan Bassnett and Andre Levy. So the translation unit becomes the culture itself. Culture turn of translation studies was initially put forward by Bassnett and Levy in 1990. Translation and narrative theory. Mona Baker examines the role played by translators and interpreters in mediating conflict. Translation is, according to Mona Baker, translation is not innocent. It is not about building bridges or enabling communication, as is commonly assumed, but it is about the active circulation and promotion of narratives in all types of conflict, but particularly in an international conflict such as the war in Iraq and the so-called war in terrorism. Translation is central to the ability of all parties to legitimize their version of events, their narratives. Since this type of conflict is played out in the international arena and cannot simply be resolved by appealing to local constituencies at home, each party to the conflict has to rely on various processes of translation to elaborate and promote a particular narrative. Then we move on to Lawrence Venuti, great scholar. He introduced scandals of translation and he discussed hegemony of English language. Lawrence Venuti is a prominent figure in modern translation studies. Scandals of translation is cultural hegemony and ethnocentric reduction of the foreign text to target language cultural values, which is clear in domestication practices and helps the global hegemony of English. Venuti emphasizes the pattern of power and dominance found in any cultural linguistic realm. Translation and cannibalism. We see Basil Hatem discusses the foreignization in the Arab world, and he recommends that we should, in the Arab world, we should empower our Arabic language. This was the case in Brazil. We have the Campos brother in Brazil, Haroldo and Augusto, who developed a cannibalistic approach to translation, which means that they empower their target language, their uh, as opposed to the dominant languages. What distinguishes post-colonial approaches to translation is that they examine intercultural encounters in contexts marked by unequal power relations. So, what happens in Brazil that they want to empower their native language against the Spanish. So here translation or the act of translation is compared to a cannibalistic act. Translating is seen as empowering act and nourishing act to the native language.